All right, we are about ready to begin. The last time we met, we discussed the basic cycle of all cycles, which is the lunation cycle. We looked at things passing from a new moon, which is the beginning of the cycle, through the first quarter, and finally the full moon, and then coming back home. We looked at it as the basic cycle for all binary cycles and for perhaps all cycles of any kind. It is a giving or a drawing out of energy to build something, and then after the climax of the building, a deconstruction or taking apart and learning what was done in the first half of the cycle while the second half is transpiring. Now this time we're going to look into the basis, the astronomical basis of the lunation cycle, so we can see how it can be used astrologically. This may be extremely short. I'm not certain. I have no idea of what's going to come out. I have made some diagrams, and we'll begin doing that. We're looking at the basic relationship of the sun, the moon, and the earth in the lunation cycle. We're going to look at new moons, full moons, solar eclipses, and lunar eclipses. And we're going to look at the periodicity of them and understand how we can use them astrologically. All right. Well, all right. Let me walk over to the screen and make sure that I can see that this is clear enough to be discerned. Okay. This is a diagram of the solar system with just the sun, the earth, and the moon. We're seeing it from the top. We'll look at it from a different point of view later on. Now in this is the earth. The earth rotates this way on its axial rotation, and it goes this way in its orbital revolution. This is true of all of the planets. They all move the same direction, and they all rotate in the same direction, except Uranus is a little bit unusual. Its orbital revolution is the same as all the other planets, but it appears to rotate the opposite direction. But that's only an appearance. That's because the poles of Uranus are 93 degrees tilted, so it looks like they're going the opposite direction. All right, now we want to look at the moon. Now the moon is not unique, but there are not many heavenly bodies that do this. The axial rotation of the moon is exactly equal to its orbital revolution. This means it turns on its axis once while it is revolving around the Earth. The upshot of this is something we all know, That is, the sun always shows us the same face. And showing us the same face means we never get to see the other side. I think it was just this week that the Chinese space program brought back some earth, some soil, I should say, some soil from the backside of the moon, the hidden side of the moon that we don't see. Now let's look at this. If the moon is here, this is a new moon. We see the same side of it, the same side is facing us, but because the sun is right behind it, we never see the moon. It's called the dark of the moon. The new moon is, okay, I had to check something in the devices. So at a new moon, we never see the moon, even though it is facing us, the sun is behind us, and we are blinded by the sun. Gradually, as the moon comes out of conjunction from the sun, we see a little sliver after the sun has set. And when we get to the first quarter, the moon has rotated as it has revolved. It has revolved as it has moved around the Earth. So, because of the position of the sun, the moon is facing us, but it reflects the sun's light, and we see only half of the moon. So this is what a quarter moon is when you see half of the moon. Then we have a full moon. When the moon is opposite the sun, and we can see it reflects back all of its face. And remember, it's always the same face. And this is a full moon. Now, in this drawing is not true to life, because sometimes the sun blocks the moon and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the sun blocks, the earth blocks the sunlight and we don't see the moon, and that's called an eclipse. But most of the time there are not eclipses. And finally we have a third quarter moon, where again we see half of the moon because only half of it is illumined and the other side is dark, and half of it is visible to us. Now the whole cycle of the moon around the Earth takes 28 days. 28 and a little bit. But from new moon to new moon, it's 29 plus days. The reason being that during the time that the moon has gone around the Earth has moved forward, and in order for the sun to be conjoined to the moon, it has to go a little further. Now, 29 days is short of a month. This means that there are more than 12 new moons during a year, and there are actually 13 of them. And so we say every 28 days this occurs. So every sign of the zodiac is going to have one new moon as the sun is passing through every sign of the zodiac. One sign of the moon one sign of the sun will have two new moons in it. So, all right, now we have an idea of the rhythm. So the cycle that we talked about last time, going from new to full and full back to new, happens once a month. Now, the astrology of this is that all the stages of the cycle that we spoke of, the building up, the waxing half of the cycle, and the waning half of the cycle, you'll experience every month. So since the new moon is the beginning of the cycle and the new moon initiates the activity of the cycle that is going to be built on and then dissolved, this means that that every new moon, every month, you can start something new. And the effect of the new moon lasts at least for the first 2 weeks of the 28 days or 29 days of the lunation cycle. But in general, it is treated that the effect of a new moon lasts a month. So what you remember, what we're trying to do is what we have looked at progressions and we have looked at transits, and we're trying to narrow things down to a period in time. So if there is a 3-year period of a secondary progression, and within that there is a transit of an outer planet, we want to know when there's an event or when there's an activity that could be triggering that off. And we're saying that one of those things that brings around a smaller period of time and very often an event is a lunar cycle, especially a lunation. So we understand now that each month there is a new initiation, a new activation of things, and at the new moon, that's an important time for narrowing down the larger scale time. As we said last time, each new moon has a flavor of its own, and that is very meaningful. Now, what we want to understand is that some new moons and some full moons are special. They are special because they are eclipses. So now we want to understand something about eclipses. To do that, let's look at another diagram. Okay. Make sure that I have the right diagram here. Okay. This diagram is a diagram of the solar system, just the sun and the Earth. But this is looking at it on edge. Now this is pretty much a universal shape for travel in space. By that I mean, I guess I'm not going to be in the picture here. The shape for travel in space is a ball. Wait a second here, this is... There, this is what we're looking at. I got the wrong diagram. This is the shape of a universal form in space. We have here, in this case, the sun, which is a huge ball of light, which is much more than the actual perimeter of the sun itself. It's just a huge ball of light, and it has around it a disk. Remember the stories, the classic flying saucers with a ball ball-shaped body and then a disk around it, the flying saucer. If you think about it, that's the shape of the solar system. Even this modified or abbreviated solar system here, which is just the sun and the earth. And but if you look at it, that's what a galaxy is. A galaxy has a black hole in the center, and around that black hole is a massive bright area, and then you have the disk with the arms of the galaxy in. So when you're looking on edge at a galaxy, you have the same thing as what we're looking at here. All right. Now, this is for a purpose. We want to say that all in this disk around the sun, actually it turns out to be a very narrow band. Let's simplify it here, and let's just make it a narrow band. Now in this band, it's just a few degrees wide, and all the planets are in this one band, with the exception of two planets that get outside of it a little more than others. One is Pluto, way out in the boonies. Pluto gets somewhere in the teens of degrees, I think something like maybe 19 degrees. And the other one is the inmost planet that we know of, which is Mercury. And Mercury is also, it gets more outside of the band. Okay. So we're saying that to this band, we're right in the center of it. If we take this as a disk around the sun, we call that band the ecliptic. And the Earth is right in the center of the ecliptic. But the Earth is not upright. The Earth is at an angle of 23 degrees. So if this is the equator and this is the pole is at an angle. And so we have that when the sun, let's take the Earth system, when the sun is at the summer solstice, the angle, I don't know how to say it, the North Pole is struck maximally. If we have the autumnal equinox, the sun strikes right on the equator. When you have the winter solstice, because of the angle, I should say, the sun strikes the southern hemisphere, and when you have the when you again have the spring equinox, the vernal equinox, the sun strikes right on the equator. So we can see that there is a cycle on the Earth according to where it is in the ecliptic. The way it's pictured here, this is pictured as spring because the sun is exactly on the equator. Now, the moon, if we want to put the moon in this picture, the moon goes around the Earth. Now clearly this is a picture of a full moon. But sometimes, depending on the angles, sometimes the Earth will block the sun from being reflected off of the moon. And that is called an eclipse. So now we want to look at another diagram in order to see how that happens. All right. Yeah, this is going very fast. I don't know that we're going to be here for even a full hour. This is the Earth. This is the North Pole of the Earth, and it's inclined This is the ecliptic. The Earth is inclined from the pole of the ecliptic, it's 23 degrees. Actually, 23, 21 minutes and 23 seconds. So this is a pole of the ecliptic. I don't know if this is all showing up. I guess it is. All right. Now what we want to understand, we're going to talk about two different motions. We're talking about the moon. Now the moon, this is exaggerated in this diagram, but the orbit of the moon is not coincident with the ecliptic. It has its own, it is inclined to the ecliptic. This is an exaggerated diagram, but I think it's about 3 degrees if I remember correctly. It's inclined 3 degrees to the ecliptic. Now what we want to understand is how the orbit of the moon is changed over time. Now, I can't go back to that other diagram. When a heavenly body crosses the ecliptic, the place where it crosses is called a node. And what we're looking at is the moon's nodes. We want to understand the moon's nodes because they are constantly changing. They change every 19 years. There's a repetition of them, but so they're changing over a 19-year cycle. And we want to understand why that happens. So we're going to look at the gravitational interplay between the moon and the Earth. Now this picture of the Earth here, we can see that the Earth is not a sphere because it's rotating on its axis so swiftly. We think of the Earth as being hard, but it's actually quite fluid. And because it's rotating on its axis, it bulges at the equator. And this diagram here is equatorial bulge. This means that it's a little bit flat at the poles. The actual shape of the Earth is not a sphere. It is a problate ellipsoid, if you want to know the mathematical term for it, which is sort of like a rotating egg, only an egg is really extreme as an ellipsoid. And on top of that, the shape of the Earth is not regular, it's lumpy. So it is a lumpy problate ellipsoid. So all right, now a planet in its orbit stays in this disk, and it stays true to that disk because of its momentum. That is to say that the momentum keeps a constant disk. All right, now let's say the moon, we're approaching the north node, when the moon is going to go north of the ecliptic, which is the sun's path. Now, as it approaches the ecliptic, it has a constant straight disk that it normally follows. But when it gets close to the ecliptic, its attraction to this bulge is greater than its attraction to the poles. And this causes it causes two things. The moon affects the Earth, and the Earth affects the moon. As the Earth approaches the ecliptic, the effect on the Earth is the pull of the moon on the bulge of the Earth produces a little jerk. And that little jerk has has an effect. Any rotating body, when something rotates at right angles, there is energy. There is a projection of energy. I don't know how to say it. It's called torque. It produces a torque, and that torque pulls the pole of the Earth outward, so that just for a second, the Earth has a little wobble, torque wobble, and a complete wobble of the Earth takes 25,868 years. And it causes the precession of the equinox. But that's not the subject for tonight. What we're talking about is the regression of the moon's nodes. So we have looked at what happens is after the Earth has been tilted a little bit, it gets corrected afterwards, but the damage has been done. So as it's coming to the ecliptic, it causes a little torque reaction, and when it gets past the ecliptic, it corrects itself. Now let's look at the effect of the moon on the Earth. So as the moon is approaching the ecliptic, the moon comes to but the bulge attracts it, and it comes to a place a little earlier on the ecliptic. And after it gets past the ecliptic, it rights itself because it's a momental disk, and it's going to remain true. But again, the damage has been done, and now the place where it crosses the ecliptic is a little bit before where it had been crossing. The same thing happens at the other side when the moon is going back south again. The same equatorial bulge is there, and the same. So gradually, it works its way backward through the zodiac, or through the whole disk, so that if we looked at it from Earth, it looks like it's going backwards through the zodiac. And this is called the regression of the moon's nodes. It takes 19 years. Now why are we so interested in the moon's nodes? Because when the moon crosses the ecliptic and it is in a position with the, I can't go back and forth between the drawings, I can't do that. I have to change the drawings. When a new moon occurs, when the moon is at the moon's nodes, that means it is going to be an eclipse of the sun, because we're looking at a difference of angles, and the difference of angles is that such that if the moon crosses and it is a full moon at the time that it's at the moon's nodes, then there's going to be a lunar eclipse. So what we're saying is that we have new moons and full moons. But when a new moon or a full moon happens at near the moon's nodes, there's going to be an eclipse. Now, the way the angles work out, I'll just give you the figures now, because in order to give you the pictures of all these things, I actually have machines that I can demonstrate this, but I would have had to have gotten into the attic, and it would have been a terribly difficult thing for me to do. So, I'll just give you the facts of it now, and so now you understand, or you'll know what we're dealing with. The fact of it is that there are a minimum of 4 eclipses in a calendar year. There are 2 solar eclipses and 2 lunar eclipses. However, under certain rare angle circumstances, there can be as many as 7 eclipses in a year. It doesn't happen often, but yes, there can be 7, because this is not just a matter of the cycle. This cycle of the moon of 28 days is called the cycle of Saros. It isn't just a matter of the cycle of Saros. It has to do with the length of the regular calendar year, which doesn't have anything to do with that. All right. Yeah, I'm trying, obviously I'm being very greedy and I'm trying to say a lot of different things. Now, when a new moon or full moon is exactly at the moon's nodes, then you will have a total eclipse of one kind or another. Let's take the lunar case first. If the eclipse is exactly at the north or south node of the moon, there will be a complete blot out of the moon. The sun is a little different because the orbit of the moon is such that sometimes it's closer to the Earth and sometimes it's further away from the Earth. And when it is closer to the Earth, even though it is lined up completely at a new moon with the moon's nodes, it doesn't block out the sun because it isn't big enough. And what happens in a total eclipse when the moon is close to the Earth is there's a little ring of light. And that little ring of light is called an anus. And that is called an annular eclipse. But if the moon is, that happens if the moon is further away from the Earth. I made a mechanical mistake there. But if the moon is closer to the Earth, it is bigger. And it can block out the entire sun, and that is a total solar eclipse. If the eclipse is close, but not exactly at the moon's nodes, when the new moon or full moon happens, you have a partial eclipse. And you have a partial eclipse that is either a partial solar or a partial lunar eclipse. Okay, now we want to understand the astrology of this. Obviously, if an eclipse, I'm going to be over here, I guess. If an eclipse happens twice a year, the effect of an eclipse, a solar eclipse, is for a half of a year. However, since things with the sun involve a year, the effect of an eclipse can last a full year. And it may be piling on. You might have a total eclipse and followed by another eclipse a half a year later, and that eclipse a half a year later piles on to that total eclipse and strengthens the effect of it. So this is what we want. We're talking about the effectiveness of an eclipse, and the effectiveness of an eclipse is a minimum of a half a year after the eclipse. But we're going to talk a little bit more about something a little different in just a few minutes. Now, an eclipse of the moon, even though there are only 2 a year, is not quite as strong. It isn't as long lasting. Yes, there are only 2 a year, but the effect of a lunar eclipse is probably just a few months long. Now, we want to understand this in terms of astrology. Suppose we see again that a person is under a very good solar progression, which is something favorable for some project that they're working on, and suppose there is also a transit in the air. And then an eclipse comes along, and this means that for a half a year, it's a heyday. Now, clearly, the eclipse, whether it is a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, is more significant if it conjoins or opposes a planet in the horoscope. Suppose that the solar eclipse conjoins Jupiter. This is likely very favorable that for the next half a year, or even right under the eclipse, that there will be a favorable period of time for accomplishing things. This is, so this is important for understanding things. And the same thing with a eclipse of the moon. Since the effect of the eclipse of the moon is shorter, that might be a period within that annual period of the total eclipse. The eclipse of the moon might indicate a time within that half year that is even better for accomplishing something, or is even more disastrous if a person is in trouble or if their health is failing or something like that. Okay, so now we understand that each month there's a new moon, and each month there is a full moon. In fact, there are 13 a year, and so there are these cycles that we talked about in the last talk. There are 13 of them per year, and each one has a different flavor. And now we can see the effect of them. We're looking at short-term influences. And we're saying that with eclipses, there are at least 4 per year, at least 2 solar and 2 lunar, and sometimes a few more than that. However, the way it is, if there are only 4 eclipses, the events are happening very close to the moon's nodes. When there are more in a year, they're going to be partial, and they're not going to be as effective because things are not exact. This is like, we know this from looking at aspects in a horoscope. If the aspect has a wide orb, it isn't going to be as pronounced in its effect as if it has an exact orb, which is called a partile orb. So the same thing happens with new moons and full moons. All right, now we have some idea of a rhythm. Now this is something you may want to do as an exercise to get an understanding of this, especially if you are a little older. If you are a little older, say you're 60 years older, you have gone through 3 cycles of Saros, because they take 19 years, so roughly that's 20 years. And so if you look at what, if things are happening in your life under new and full moons, go back 19 years. And if you keep a journal, or if you keep a diary or something like that, when you go back 19 years, you will see how you reacted then. You're older now, and you have more experience, but you still respond to the cycle of Saros, to the cycle of new moons and eclipses, you're still the same being, but you're just a little bit wiser, you're a little bit more experienced. And if you can go back and look at what you did under different cycles of Saros, then you can, it becomes clear to you that yes, there is a doctrine of eclipses, and there is a rhythm in my life that this responds to. Now I want to talk about some other things. Let's talk about rhythms. Now, in your horoscope, if you follow new moons and eclipses, if you follow them as you go through each year, you'll find that sometimes all of the new moons, I have never seen it be all of them, but sometimes the new moons many of them will be conjoined to a planet. And the formula for that is, if you have a point in the zodiac, if something is 13 degrees before that point, or 13 degrees after that point, or 180 degrees plus or minus 13 degrees, there will be a relationship between a new moon and a full moon. And it's good to understand your lunation rhythm. In my horoscope, I could have brought it up, but it would have been way too much technical material. In my horoscope, it turns out that there are quite a few of these relationships. They aren't aspects, but they are rhythms. So there is one period in life when the new moon will hit, and then the full moon will hit, and then you're talking about hitting some planet in the horoscope. And there'll be quite a few hits in a year's time. I remember back when I was 39 years old, I had cancer. And there were all sort of mini crises. I was treating the cancer with an alternative therapy, and there were many crises in that period that I was doing the alternative therapy, and those many crises, actually some of them were healing reactions, and I would come out of the crisis being much brighter and much more energetic than I had gone in. And those many crises were based on the new and full moons that were striking benefic planets or benefically aspected planets in my horoscope. So this is something you want to do. You want to sit down with an ephemeris, a multi-year ephemeris. If you have computer software, the software will do it all for you. You want to take each year of a 19-year cycle and see how many hits there are of new moons and full moons to planets in your horoscope. You want to be pretty accurate. I would say not more than 2 degrees away from a conjunction or opposition to a planet in your horoscope. And when you get that, and if you look back and see what happened in your life, you come to a very good understanding to how you respond to it. I don't know how to say it. It's sort of like you're driving down a highway, and the highway has certain curves and certain blind spots and things like that. The first time you go through it, you have to be very, very cautious. But the next time you go through it, and each succeeding time you go through it, you realize what you have to do at certain places to take advantage to get the safest and the swiftest way to get through this passage of highway. And that is what you do when you're looking at at the cycle of Saros, at the cycle of new moons and full moons over the whole 19 years, you understand then that there is that kind of 19-year rhythm in your life. All right. Now I have one more thing I want to look at. Now let's change this into something else. Let's change this into a horoscope. Now suppose Now suppose you have a significant planet. I don't know, let's just say it's here in the 5th house. And let's say it's the sun. Now, suppose there is an eclipse of the sun right exactly on your natal sun. So the moon is here and the sun is here. You look in the ephemeris and you can see that there will be an eclipse of the sun conjoining your sun. Now, things in life aren't isolated incidents. Things in life, you go through periods where things build up and then they diminish. And this is true of effects of eclipses. Now, the way this works, this is the eclipse that conjoins your sun. But 29 days earlier, there was a new moon. And 58 days earlier, there was a new moon. Now, this one, the one that's 58 days earlier, will be sextile to the eclipse point. And when there is that, I only do this with eclipses because you could do it with new moons, but you're getting into things that are so faint that they don't count. But 58 days before the eclipse, that new moon will start an incident that applies to the event in your life. Suppose this is the culmination, like you've been working on something, writing a book or something like that, and the culmination comes at the eclipse. This says that 58 days before that, there will be an opportunity to make a breakthrough. And you can only work up to 90 degrees. The eclipse, the new moon 90 degrees before will indicate perhaps the onset of a problem that reaches its height at the full moon, at the eclipse. And then the moons that follow indicate a diminishing of the influence. And up to 90 degrees. Up to 90 degrees, you get to see, how things build up. This is in music or in art or things like that. If the artist is trying to get something across, there is a build-up to a crescendo moment, to a moment that is of great import. And that's what you're indicating here. And you don't just have an event and everything drops off. Things taper off after an event. So when you're looking at your life in the past relative to new moons and eclipses, you want to look at the ones that preceded when there was an eclipse that was close to one of your planets, or right exactly on one of your planets. You want to see what built up to it and what passed away. Now this brings up something about life. Most of the time, we're so involved with life as it's happening to us that we don't stop to think, and we don't, sometimes you look back and say, oh my goodness, I did that, and then this ensued, and nonetheless, it brought out this very good quality in me. And it's important, if you're trying to understand your life, or you're trying to help somebody using astrology, it's important to understand how these things happen in a person. So this is why it's your own horoscope is your biggest responsibility. Before you ever look at anyone else's horoscope, you have to have a fairly good understanding of your own, because if you don't have that, you're likely to project your own psychology onto someone else, and then things become murky and tangled and everything else. You don't have an objectivity. So this is, again, one of these reasons why keeping a journal, especially if you can keep an astrological journal. Now you know, I hope most of the people viewing this video are young enough that they can still see one more cycle of Saros, so that they can see the events of their life as happening according to this cycle. Because this is a very fundamental cycle for, the sun and the moon. As we said last time we met, we said the sun and the moon, they are the most major cycle in our human experience, and following it is, things come to birth according to the sun and the moon. So I really do recommend keeping an astrological journal. Unfortunately, I don't do that anymore. There were times that I did, and the fruitfulness in terms of astrological understandings, I used to read the newspapers and see the main events that were happening in the world under astrological conditions. And for example, in the Vietnam Wars, when I was most regular with working with astrological journal. And sure enough, when a Buddhist would immolate himself in protest to something, happened under a new moon in Sagittarius, the sign of religion. And you get an insight of how things, by looking at the main events out in the world as they're happening in history, and what happens in your own personal life. That the whole idea of astrology is when you can see the horoscope and experience the events in your life. You want to experience the events in your life because that's experience, and your soul growth depends on experience. But if you have an astrology, you can understand the events that are happening in your life, because it gives you a means for doing that. All right, this took not quite an hour, but this is about all I have to say. We now understand the mechanics of what produces a new moon and a full moon, and what makes one of those, either the new moon or full moon, to be an eclipse. And I hope you have tools now for understanding or looking at your own life and seeing your own rhythm. Like some people have new moon and full moon hits very even. Like they have so many per year, and then there are people like me that have a whole bunch in some years and then nothing in other years. Then you understand your own rhythm, and you know what to deal. I don't know how to say it. If you're being pummeled by destiny that you have brought to ripeness, You want to know whether that's going to continue or not. You want to know whether to brace yourself to be ready or whether this is just going to be a few events and then it's over until another time in the cycle of sorrows. And that's very helpful. It's really very helpful. If you know that you only have to endure a few more things, it's easier to face them. Whereas if it seems like they're endless, like month after month after month, things start happening. All right, that is all I have to offer tonight. I hope that this was clear enough so that you could understand what's going on, and that you can apply it. Because I put a lot of time and effort into doing these talks, and I do that because I hope people are going to apply it and use it to live better lives, because that is the virtue of astrology. It gives us the opportunity to have better lives. So thank you very much.